Hi, I'm Estelle, and on New Year's Eve, my parents congratulated every single person at that table, except me. No mention of my name, no nod to my year, just silence. I sat there smiling through it, pretending not to notice. But inside, something cracked. They'd erased me so casually, as if I'd never mattered. So I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and showed them everything they chose to forget. Why did that moment feel like war? And why did their silence scream louder than applause? The wheels of the plane hissed against the runway as we landed at Logan. I watched the gray slush of a Massachusetts December smear across the window, the sky low, and the light already fading, although it wasn't even 4 o'clock. My phone buzzed before we'd even taxied to the gate. It was from my mother, Vera. "Don't be late tomorrow night." No greeting, no, "How was your flight?" Just the same clipped tone that had set the rhythm of my childhood. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed. It was almost funny how she managed to make me feel like a teenager again with a single sentence. I collected my bag slowly, not rushing to get off the plane. The cabin smelled of coffee gone stale. Businessmen in coats jostled around me, eager to get back to their meetings, while I moved at my own pace. This trip had been planned for weeks. Vera's New Year's Eve dinner was mandatory in her words. Yet, even on the flight, I'd known what to expect. I could feel it before I'd even stepped inside the house. The weight of being an afterthought, the sharpness of every small omission. The shuttle ride to the rental car center was quiet except for the driver's radio, a local talk show debating the snowstorm forecast for New Year's Day. As we passed the skyline of Boston, brick and glass under a bruised sky, I remembered being a little girl pressed against these same windows, counting the tall buildings. Back then, everything about coming home felt warm. Now it felt like crossing a line into a theater where I'd been cast in a role I never auditioned for, the one who stays out of the picture. By the time I reached my parents' neighborhood in the suburbs, the streetlights were flickering on. The colonial houses were strung with white Christmas lights that had begun to sag, and the snow along the driveways had turned to icy ridges. Their house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, large and symmetrical, shutters painted a deep green. I parked at the curb, shutting off the engine but staying inside a moment. My hands rested on the steering wheel. Tomorrow was the big dinner. Tonight was just helping out. That was what I'd been told, yet I already knew how that would go. Inside the foyer, heat hit me like a wall, heavy with the smell of rosemary and butter. Vera's voice came from the kitchen, bright but tight. "Callista, don't forget the candles for the table." "Orson, did you confirm with the caterer?" I slipped off my coat and stepped in, my boots leaving small wet prints on the hardwood. "Hi, Mom," I said. She turned, smiled briefly without warmth. "Oh, Estelle, you're here." Then back to her list. Not a question about my flight, not even a glance at my bag. The kitchen looked like a scene from a lifestyle magazine. Silver trays lined up, handwritten seating charts on the counter, Callista arranging centerpieces of winter berries. Orson, taller now than I remembered, leaned against the fridge scrolling on his phone, making calls with a practiced tone. "Do you need me to set the table?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Vera waved a hand without looking. "We've got it covered." Callista didn't look up. Orson smirked like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Yeah, we're all set. Don't worry about it." The words were polite, but the undertone was familiar. "You're not needed." I moved toward the dining room anyway, peeking at the long mahogany table already covered with crisp linen. 10 place settings. Name cards written in my mother's perfect script. My name wasn't there yet. I wasn't surprised. The laughter from the kitchen swelled again as Orson cracked a joke about something I couldn't hear. They were a team, synchronized, like dancers who had rehearsed every step. I stood in the doorway, invisible. I drifted upstairs to the guest room, carrying my bag, telling myself I'd unpack later. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I opened my phone and scrolled through photos from the past year, my own work in San Francisco, the nonprofit I'd built, the community awards. None of it would be mentioned tomorrow night. I knew that as surely as I knew the smell of my mother's perfume. This was the pattern. Me watching from the sidelines, them living their version of a family story without me. I thought back to Christmases when I was 8, 10, 15. Every holiday, I was the one holding the camera, never in the photo. My brothers and sisters laughed in matching sweaters while I adjusted the focus. Once at Thanksgiving, I asked to be in a picture. My mother said, "Someone has to take it." That small moment had stuck like a splinter. It wasn't about a photograph. It was about belonging. And year after year, the splinter had sunk deeper. Downstairs, I heard Callista call out something about guest favors. My name wasn't among the tasks. Not for flowers, not for seating, not for dessert, just like always. I walked back down, standing in the hallway watching them move like clockwork. "Need me to run an errand? Pick something up?" I tried again. Vera shook her head. "It's all under control." Orson didn't even look up. Callista murmured something to him, and they both laughed. I stepped back, leaning against the wall. The scene in front of me blurred a little, not from tears, but from the realization that this wasn't new. It was scripted. They knew their lines. Mine was silence. But silence can be studied. Silence can be sharpened. My fingers tightened around my phone, the cool glass grounding me. The screen lit my palm like a tiny stage light. No one noticed. They were too busy rehearsing their roles for tomorrow. In that moment, the air in the house felt heavy, like the pause before a storm. I thought, almost calmly, they don't even realize I'm here. I'm not even part of their story anymore. The next day moved like a tide I couldn't stop. Morning blurred into afternoon as I stayed mostly in the guest room, unpacking slowly, scrolling through emails from work to ground myself. Through the floorboards, I could hear Vera's voice rising and falling as she orchestrated the last details. By mid-afternoon, the house smelled of roast meats, citrus, and polished wood. Snow fell steadily outside, muting the neighborhood into a quiet gray. I helped myself to coffee in the kitchen, but no one asked me to help with anything else. It was the same choreography: Orson bringing in wine boxes, Callista arranging flowers, Vera issuing crisp instructions. I learned long ago not to offer a third time. Instead, I observed, filed things away, waiting for the night ahead. By dusk, the house transformed. Candlelight flickered against the cream walls. The table had been stretched with extra leaves to seat 12. Chairs stood perfectly aligned. Silverware glimmered. It should have felt festive, but to me it felt like a stage set, beautiful, but designed for someone else's play. I changed into a navy dress, understated but neat, and paused by the mirror. My own reflection looked composed, even serene. Inside, I was measuring every breath. When the first guests arrived, neighbors, a couple of Vera's colleagues, they were ushered in with warmth, laughter, coats being taken, compliments about the house. I took a spot near the dining room doorway, smiling, nodding, but not truly included. The chatter swirled around me without landing. Orson emerged from the kitchen carrying champagne, Callista trailing behind him with practiced grace. They looked like the hosts, not guests. We were called to dinner promptly at 7. I followed everyone into the dining room, taking my seat where a name card had finally appeared, slightly off to the side. The long, polished oak table gleamed under the chandelier. Fine china, crystal glasses, little sprigs of pine at each place. I noticed the head of the table wasn't occupied by my father, Richard. He was at the far end, quiet, already half fading into the background. Orson sat confidently at the other end, Callista to his right, Vera to his left. They basked in her attention like royalty receiving homage. Vera raised her glass, her voice carrying. "To Orson," she said, beaming, "the pride of our family. To Callista, who brings us grace and elegance." Glasses clinked. Guests murmured their congratulations. Orson accepted it with a modest shrug that wasn't modest at all. Callista dipped her head, eyes shining. Around me, the table pulsed with approval and admiration. I lifted my own glass but didn't drink. My seat felt like it was inches from the table, even though I was right there. The candlelight flickered across faces leaning toward each other, toward Orson and Callista, away from me. I felt my lips curve in a small, neutral smile. Inside, the sting was familiar, like a bruise pressed again. Courses arrived: salad, soup, roast lamb. Conversation flowed, punctuated by laughter. I kept my contributions minimal, polite responses to polite questions from guests, but never from my family. When I tried to speak to my mother about a charity project, just a small anecdote, she interrupted before I finished. "Let's keep the focus tonight where it belongs," she said lightly, eyes flicking toward Orson. The table went silent for a second. I heard the click of Callista's bracelet as she adjusted it. Then someone made a joke, and laughter returned, just a little too loud. At my expense. Orson smirked knowingly. Callista's polite smile concealed something sharper. I sat back, my hands folded under the table. The napkin between my fingers felt like cloth and stone all at once. This was the pattern, but tonight it landed differently. I thought of the camera in my hands as a child, how every holiday my view was through a lens while the others smiled. I'd believed back then that one day I'd be invited into the frame. But here I was, decades later, still a shadow at the edge. The chatter blurred. Someone mentioned Orson's new business venture. Another praised Callista's latest award. Vera laughed her clear, proud laugh. I watched them, the family and guests, as though from a distance. I realized my place in their story wasn't just small. It was scripted to be invisible. Like a ghost at a banquet. Present, but unacknowledged. I tried once more, carefully. "Actually, I wanted to share something." My voice was calm, but sure. Vera cut across before I could finish, smiling as if to soften the edge. "We can talk about that later, Estelle. Tonight is special." Her eyes moved on. The silence that followed wasn't the polite pause of conversation, it was a door closing. Laughter resumed, warmer than before, like the sound of a lock turning. I chewed a bite of lamb without tasting it, swallowing past the tightness in my throat. Not tears, just anger held still. I wasn't going to plead for space in their narrative. Under the table, my hands clenched the napkin, folding it until it left lines in my skin. The candles wavered in a draft, shadows stretching across the table like long fingers. In those shadows, I saw myself, always present, never counted. That night, I would later think, their laughter wasn't just at the table, it was at my expense. But in the moment I stayed quiet, cataloging faces, words, gestures, understanding finally that this exclusion was no accident. It was deliberate. And deliberate things can be met, measured, answered. The sound of laughter from chapter still echoed in my head as the night crawled forward. I stayed seated at the same table, my eyes following the shadows cast by the tall candles. They flickered and stretched, as if trying to escape the room. Conversations drifted around me, half-remembered anecdotes, business deals, vacation plans, but none of it landed on me. The house felt smaller now, like the walls had leaned in closer, while the people at the table had grown more distant. Vera's voice cut through the low hum. "Callista, why don't you do the toast?" she said brightly, as though nothing had just happened. The chatter softened. Callista stood gracefully, lifting her champagne flute. "Orson isn't just the pride of this family, he's the one carrying us into the future." Her eyes swept the table with the warmth of a hostess, but they slid over me like I wasn't there. Guests clapped, some whistled. Orson straightened his tie, smiling as if the crown had been placed on his head. I kept my face neutral, taking a small sip of water instead of champagne. The words hit me harder than any insult. They weren't rough or obvious. They were polite, even sweet, but they erased me completely. I had spent years building a career on my own, without their money or influence. Yet in this room, it was as if I'd done nothing at all. My father, Richard, sat at the far end of the table, hands clasped loosely in his lap. He smiled at Callista, but didn't join the applause. I wondered if he noticed the pattern, or if silence had simply become his survival too. Beside him, Elowen swung her legs under the chair, a child's innocence lost among crystal glasses and adult games. Vera tapped her spoon against her glass. "One more round," she declared. "A toast from me." She rose, shoulders squared, eyes sweeping the table. To Orson for his vision, to Callista for her support, to Elowen, our bright future, and to Richard. She paused to glance at my father. "For keeping us steady." She raised her glass high. The guests followed. When she lowered it, the room glowed with warmth and approval. Except at my place, where the air turned to ice. She hadn't said my name. Not even once. Not a slip of the tongue. Not a stumble. A deliberate omission. The silence of it roared louder than her voice. I felt it slice through me, clean and cold, like a scalpel cutting me out of the family portrait. My hands stayed on the table, palms down, steady. Inside, my heart slammed against my ribs. The camera in my mind moved slowly across the table, faces smiling, leaning toward each other, shining with shared pride. None looking at me, none acknowledging the gap where my name should have been. The hum of conversation returned, a little too bright, like a song playing over static. I sat still, letting the moment etch itself into memory. I remembered past holidays, the year Orson got his scholarship, Callista, her first big contract, toasts for everyone, congratulations spilling like champagne. I had been the photographer, the errand runner, the one who made the place settings. When I tried to speak of my own work, someone would cough, or the subject would shift. I used to tell myself it was bad timing. Tonight, it was no longer possible to pretend. This wasn't timing. This was intent. A guest across from me asked Orson about his expansion plans. He launched into details about investors, partnerships, numbers. Callista added a quip about their shared dreams. Vera laughed, a note of pride ringing out. I sat back, breathing slow, tasting metal at the back of my throat. This was their world. They had built it carefully, and in their blueprint, I was invisible. I lowered my gaze, fingers brushing the edge of my phone under the table. Its screen stayed dark, but just feeling the cool glass steadied me. I wasn't going to make a scene, not yet. I had learned to study the game before making a move, but my mind whispered something it had never dared before. This isn't neglect. This is exile. Around me, silverware clinked, glasses refilled. Someone called for another toast. I heard Callista laugh softly. Orson murmur something in reply. Their voices blurred into a single sound, like waves breaking against a shore I no longer stood on. I inhaled slowly, memorizing the moment, letting it burn into my chest. I would not forget this night. And in that silence, I knew. This wasn't neglect anymore. This was exile. A quiet hush had already settled over the room when Elowen's voice cut through it like a blade. I looked up from my plate, just in time to hear her ask, "Grandma, why didn't you say Estelle's name too? Did she not do anything good this year?" Everything froze. The silverware clinked once, a tremor in the tension. Vera's fork hovered in mid-air. Orson's face went blank. The guests exchanged glances over their shoulders, uncertain. For an instant, time stretched. I felt my heart thud, equal parts shame and relief. A child had said the unthinkable, what I dared not. That question hung in the air, unbearable and sharp. I reminded myself to breathe. My throat felt tight, but I didn't speak. I sat still, letting the silence deliver the impact I couldn't voice. In that moment, I realized I'd been invisible by design. And at least now someone noticed. Vera cleared her throat. Her laughter was tight, brittle. "Oh, honey, Estelle, she's just been busy. Not much to mention this year." She aimed for softness, but it tasted cruel. The words dripped with dismissal. Orson leaned back and smirked. "Yeah, some people prefer being mysterious," he added, as though he were making a joke about an inside joke. The guests chuckled, reluctant, but complicit. I felt the flush creep up my neck. My own face must have betrayed me. I stared down at my plate, pretending to take a sip of water. It tasted thin and cold. My hands, clasped in my lap, trembled slightly. The laughter at the table now felt like a wall pressing in on me. The spotlight was off me, but the shadow of their words loomed large. I remembered once when I was 9, how I asked my parents to acknowledge a tiny accomplishment, a science fair award. They had clapped politely for my brother first, then turned to me with a forced smile and said, "That's nice, dear." I held that hurt inside me for years. Tonight, it flared back with the same sting. But grief and anger are dangerous neighbors. I didn't want to erupt in tears. That would give them the satisfaction of seeing me collapse. Instead, I folded silence into my resolve. If they wanted to laugh at me, they wouldn't get the satisfaction of breaking me. My fingers slid under the table and closed around my phone, still face down. I resisted the urge to flip it. I needed to measure my moment, to see how far I'd let them push me, to decide how I would answer, not with reaction, but with intention. Vera cleared her throat again, raising her glass. "Let's continue with dessert, shall we?" Her voice was normal, as though nothing had happened. The room exhaled. The cutlery resumed its scrape against china. The conversation resumed, softer now, as if on tiptoes. I glanced at Callista, whose eyes flickered with a half-smile, one measuring advantage. Orson's posture straightened, like a king restoring command. Vera's fingers tightened around her glass stem. None of them would admit the wound they'd just inflicted, though I could see it in their eyes. Inside me, something shifted. The pain of exclusion had always defined me, but this question from a child had broken a door I thought unbreakable. Their mockery had been invisible before. Now they had exposed it before witnesses. I drew a long breath, letting it steady me. The candle flames cast wavering shapes across the table. Their reflections danced on the crystal. Every face looked elegant, confident, except mine, held in tension. I sat upright, shoulders back. I would not shrink. If they wanted to laugh at my silence, I thought, I would make silence my weapon. I unlocked the phone and felt its glow brush across my palm. It lit my face faintly in the dim room. The screen of my phone glowed faintly in my palm, casting a cool, bluish light over the polished silverware, the rim of my wineglass, and the fine linen folded neatly across my lap. It was a small glow, almost nothing compared to the brilliance of chandeliers overhead or the flicker of candles at the center of the table. But to me, it was a beacon, steady, deliberate, undeniable. Around me, the laughter had dulled into something thinner, stretched too far like thread fraying at its edges. Guests were still talking, but their voices lacked conviction, their words tumbling out like they were following a script no one truly believed in anymore. I tilted the phone slightly, the way someone might when pretending to scroll idly through text messages. In reality, my thumb moved with precision. Each slide in the gallery had been prepared hours earlier in the small guest room upstairs. I had rehearsed this moment like someone sharpening a blade. The images slid one after another. Photos from charity galas where my name had headlined the programs, plaques from awards I had accepted on stages my family had never bothered to attend, newspaper clippings featuring my face and name tied to projects I had led. There were photos of smiling veterans from the pro bono case I'd spearheaded at my firm, families cutting ribbons on housing initiatives I had organized, university ceremonies where professors shook my hand as cameras flashed. Proof. That was all it was. Proof of everything they had erased, everything they had refused to see. I didn't lift the phone into the air like a trophy. I didn't announce it with fanfare. I simply set it down beside my plate, screen face up, and let the images move in a quiet, deliberate slideshow. For a few breaths, no one noticed. Conversations carried on about champagne brands, about Callista's new bracelet, about Orson's promotion. Forks tapped plates, napkins fluttered against lips, and the performance of civility went on unchecked. But then Orson's gaze drifted downward. His eyes caught the glow. His smile faltered. Not much, just a flicker, but it was enough. The practiced ease in his posture cracked, and for the first time in years, I saw the break I had been waiting for. I took a sip of wine, slow and unhurried, keeping my eyes on my plate as though none of this mattered to me at all. Callista leaned across the table, her voice low, clipped like she was scolding a child. "Why are you showing that?" I didn't raise my head. "Just reminding myself of the year I had." A simple sentence, quiet, almost casual, yet the weight of it landed across the table like a stone tossed into still water. The air shifted. Guests stopped in mid-sentence, unsure whether to continue. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Someone cleared their throat. Vera, my mother, forced a laugh. It was brittle, rushed, breaking at the edges. "Estelle's always had projects," she said brightly, her tone desperate to smooth over what had already been cracked. We're so proud of all our children." But her voice rang false, too fast, too rehearsed. "Right," Orson muttered, his smirk stiff now, his eyes avoiding the glow on the table. "Mysterious as always." I let the slideshow continue. My name scrolled across headlines, my face filled the frame of award ceremonies, my accomplishments looped in slow succession. I didn't need to speak. The glow of the phone did the speaking for me. I raised my gaze just slightly, sweeping the table. Callista's lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Orson tapped his glass too hard against his plate, the sound sharp in the hushed room. Vera stared at the phone as though the images themselves might burn her. And in my mind, a narration whispered, I wasn't the invisible one. They were the ones who had refused to see. I took another drink of wine, my hands steady now, and allowed the silence to stretch. The guests tried to restart chatter, voices faltering as they attempted to steer the room back into familiar territory. Someone asked about the fireworks planned for later that evening. Someone else muttered about dessert courses, but their eyes betrayed them. They kept sliding back to the glow of my phone, to the scrolling slideshow of a life they had ignored but could no longer deny. The power dynamic at the table tilted, subtle but undeniable. For the first time in years, I felt it shift inside me. Not vindication yet, not triumph, but leverage. Vera tried again. "Honey, why don't you put that away? We're having dinner," she said, her smile stretched taut like glass about to shatter. "I will," I replied evenly. My voice carried no anger, no sharpness, only calm. I just wanted to remember what I accomplished this year. Another silence followed, longer this time. Even Elowen, usually restless and fidgeting with silverware, had gone still, her small legs no longer swinging under the table. The only sound was the faint hiss of candles flickering, sending shadows dancing across the polished oak. I let the phone continue for another few moments. The light glowed, steady and persistent, until I finally tapped the screen dark. I set it aside gently, letting my fingers linger on the edge as if to draw a boundary no one else could cross. I leaned back in my chair, spine straight, gaze steady, posture calm. For the rest of the meal, no one dared meet my eyes. Orson picked listlessly at his food. Callista whispered something sharp to him, but his jaw remained tight, his smirk gone. Vera spoke in two loud bursts to nearby guests, her voice bright but hollow, latching onto trivialities as though the weight of silence might crush her otherwise. And inside me, a quiet satisfaction bloomed. Not glee, not revenge, but something deeper, steadier, the deliberate reclaiming of my own presence. I thought back to the countless dinners where I had been treated as invisible, where my silence was taken as absence, my accomplishments buried under their applause for someone else. Tonight, that silence had become a mirror, forcing them to see what they had refused to acknowledge. I hadn't needed to shout. I hadn't needed to stand. My proof, my quiet defiance had spoken louder than all of them combined. Dessert arrived, and with it came tremors in their composure. Vera's hand shook as she poured coffee, the stream spilling slightly onto a saucer. She didn't look at me. Orson excused himself with a claim about a phone call that never came. Callista shredded her napkin into uneven strips, her face pinched tight with agitation. The guests, sensitive to the shift in air, whispered among themselves in low voices. Someone remarked on the storm clouds gathering outside. Someone else asked if it would delay the fireworks. I didn't join in. I didn't need to. I met Vera's gaze once across the table. Just once. Calm, unyielding. And in that brief, fragile silence, I heard something new. Not dismissal, not indifference. Fear. The first crack in their perfect wall. The soft turbulence of change that had begun earlier in the evening still lingered, hovering like a held breath before a scream. The dining room looked deceptively calm, dim and amber-lit by the glow of tall candles, the linen folded neatly, the silverware lined in perfect symmetry. Yet beneath that outward calm, something taut coiled tighter with every passing second. The illusion of order trembled, just barely, under the weight of silence. Even after I had tapped the phone dark and set it aside, its presence glowed faintly in the minds of everyone at the table. They could pretend to eat, pretend to sip their wine, pretend to laugh at small jokes, but no one could forget the images they had just seen flashing across that little screen. Proof of my life, proof of my work, proof of everything they had tried so hard to erase. And though I hadn't spoken loudly, though I hadn't demanded recognition, that slideshow had spoken for me. It was louder than a scream, louder than years of silence. Across the table, Orson shifted in his chair. He cleared his throat with a deliberate cough, as though preparing to take the stage in a performance only he thought he could control. Then his lips curled into a smirk that never reached his eyes. "Nice scrapbook, Estelle," he said, his voice low but sharp, every syllable coated in contempt. "Cute pictures, but real success isn't just photos on a screen. It's respect. And that," he gestured vaguely toward my phone, "is something you can't post." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through the room. A hush fell sharper than before. Guests shifted in their seats, wine glasses trembled faintly in their hands. Even the candles seemed to waver, the flames bending as though they too were unsettled by his venom. I felt the sting, sharp and quick, but I let it wash over me without flinching. My hands remained steady on the table, palms pressed lightly against the starched linen. My heart beat fast, hard enough to feel in my throat, but my spine straightened, shoulders rolling back. I would not shrink. For too many years I had sat silent at dinners like this, letting their words bury me, letting their dismissals become gospel. Tonight, I refused. I lifted my chin and met his eyes squarely. My voice was calm, quiet, but firm enough to slice through the charged silence. "Respect isn't given at this table," I said. "It's hoarded. I stopped waiting for scraps." The gasp was audible, sharp enough to cut the air. Vera's hand, mid-air with a silver coffee spoon, froze. Callista's eyes widened in disbelief, her lashes fluttering as though she had misheard me. Richard's brow furrowed into a hard crease, his jaw tight. The guests, who were not blood but merely friends or colleagues, looked down at their plates, unsure if they were intruding on something sacred or monstrous. In that blazing moment, they realized something none of them had ever allowed themselves to imagine. I had found my voice, and it wasn't the voice of a child begging to be seen, nor the plea of a sister demanding fairness. It wasn't a scream, nor was it a sob. It was a line drawn in the sand. Orson leaned forward, his face shadowed by the flickering light. His voice dropped lower, carrying a thread of cold malice. "Careful, Estelle," he hissed. "Families remember who feeds them." The words were meant as a warning, a reminder of his power, his control, his smug belief that survival depended on his goodwill. But his confidence was brittle. I could hear the hairline cracks. I did not blink. I did not let him finish the thought before I answered. My voice, steady as a struck bell, cut clean through his threat. Families also remember who starved them. The spark. The moment the match met the tinder. It was small, just a handful of words, but it shifted everything. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Knives hovered mid-cut. Glasses trembled, forgotten in hands that suddenly seemed too heavy to hold them. Conversations halted, the hum of chatter evaporating into a heavy, electric silence. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Vera's face paled, her cheeks draining of color until she looked like a ghost of herself. She opened her mouth, perhaps to scold, perhaps to soothe, but no sound came out. She closed it again, lips pressed so tightly together they quivered. Callista shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between me and Orson like a spectator at a match she hadn't placed bets on. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of her napkin, twisting it slowly until the white fabric frayed at the edges. Orson's jaw clenched hard enough to pulse. He leaned back slightly, feigning indifference, but his eyes betrayed the storm building behind them. And me? I sat taller, breath even, though inside I could feel the tremor of fear. Not fear of them, not anymore, but fear of what came next, fear of how fragile this game really was. I was playing with matches in a room full of dry straw. Yet under that fear was something fiercer. Liberation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking to be seen. I was deciding to be seen. Vera broke the silence with a burst of laughter so forced it cracked like glass. "Let's not let this spoil tonight," she said, her voice brittle, her smile stretched too thin. She glanced toward the guests, her tone meant to soothe, but it was too late. The facade was already split. Dessert arrived moments later. Delicate apple tart, swirls of whipped cream, coffee in porcelain cups. But no one truly tasted it. The forks clinked faintly against china, but the sound was mechanical, joyless. I watched Orson push his plate away after a single bite, his appetite gone. Callista dabbed at her lips with her napkin, though she hadn't taken a sip of coffee. Vera's hands trembled faintly as she poured cream into her cup, spilling a thin line across the saucer. The guests attempted small talk about the forecast, about snow expected by morning, about whether the storm might delay their travel home. But their voices were muted, their smiles brittle. They were only building walls against the tension they could no longer deny. And I? I sat there, hands steepled calmly in front of me, my breathing steady. I leaned into my own composure like armor. I had exercised restraint. I had spoken truth. I had forced them to see me. In that charged quiet, a single understanding crystallized inside me. We were no longer a family gathered for dinner. We were enemies sitting across a battlefield. The warmth of the candles flickered against the ivory walls as if nothing had changed, their flames swaying gently in the draft. Yet the atmosphere told another story. Something had shifted after my words, something invisible but undeniable, like the drop in pressure before a storm breaks. The dining room was still, hushed, the hush of predators circling, gauging distance before they strike. Calm wasn't peace. Calm was strategy. Forks scraped faintly against porcelain. The delicate clink of crystal glasses sounded oddly distant, as though echoing from another house entirely. Guests smiled brittle smiles, faces that looked painted on, too polished, too bright. Beneath the surface, I felt it, the tautness, the coil winding tighter. Vera leaned forward, her smile stretched thin and brittle, the kind of smile that cracked if you looked too closely. Her voice was syrupy, but threaded with steel. She began recounting stories of family sacrifices, her words weaving carefully chosen names into the narrative. "Orson," she said with a proud tilt of her chin, "has held this family together through hard times. And Callista, she has always brought grace and light to our gatherings." Every sentence was a stitch, sewing a tapestry that wrapped around everyone at the table, everyone but me. I was deliberately left out, excised from the fabric she presented as family history. Her voice threaded needle and thread, pulling tighter and tighter until the picture looked whole, if you didn't notice the gaping hole where I should have been. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, my posture calm, my breathing even. My heart beat hard, but not erratic, steady, like a drumline. In my head, one thought pulsed clear. This is the lull before the attack. They expected me to interrupt, to protest, to throw myself into the narrative she was crafting. But not this time. The silence stretched, elastic and uncomfortable. Then Orson leaned back in his chair, the movement lazy but rehearsed, as though he had been waiting for his cue. His voice was pitched just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, rich with contempt disguised as humor. "Tell me," he drawled, his lips curling into something halfway between a smirk and a sneer. "Do any of you even know what Estelle does with her time?" He chuckled dryly, the sound hollow. His eyes, though, were sharp, cold, calculating. "She hides behind this thing she calls charity. But where's the money really going?" The words fell like stones into water, ripples spreading outward. Several guests shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. A woman near the end of the table glanced down at her wine, as if the pattern on the glass could save her from eye contact. A man cleared his throat awkwardly, unsure if this was meant as a joke or an accusation. Callista leaned in, her voice lower but sharper, each word like a knife slipped beneath the skin. "She's always been dramatic," she murmured, smiling faintly as though confiding a secret. "Maybe this is just her way of buying affection." The hit landed deeper than any toast could, sharper than silence. They weren't ignoring me anymore. They were trying to smear me right there in front of strangers. My truth wasn't being dismissed. It was being twisted, turned inside out, painted as a lie. I looked down at my hands, folded neatly on the tablecloth. My phone lay just beside my plate, dark now, but its weight was palpable, like a stone, like a loaded weapon. Heat crept slowly up the back of my neck, the flush of anger pushing against my skin. But I breathed, slow, measured, deliberate. This was the trap. They wanted me to rise, to sputter, to lash out. They wanted me to look unhinged so their narrative would seem justified. I raised my head instead, slowly, calmly. My lips curved into a faint smile, small enough to unsettle, sharp enough to slice. My voice, when it came, was soft, almost gentle, but carried the weight of iron. "It's interesting," I said, "how loudly people speculate about things they don't understand." The sentence was quiet, but it dropped into the room like a hammer. A murmur rippled across the table. Orson's smirk faltered, flickering like a candle in a draft. Callista blinked twice, thrown for a second. Vera shifted in her chair, her hand tightening around her napkin until the delicate linen creased into sharp folds. Inside, my pulse hammered hard enough to echo in my ears. Outwardly, I was composed, deliberate. I moved with the precision of someone playing a game they finally understood. I lifted my wine glass, the stem cool and slender between my fingers. I let the candlelight catch the dark red liquid, shimmering like blood, before I spoke again. "I realized something tonight," I said, my voice carrying just enough to reach the far end of the table. "Retaliation only works if I play defense. But I wasn't here to defend. I was here to end." The words weren't loud. They weren't shouted, but they landed with the gravity of a verdict, heavy, irrevocable. Richard's fork paused mid-air. He glanced at Vera, his jaw set, his expression tight. A few guests dropped their gazes into their plates, as though the polished porcelain could shield them from the weight of my words. Vera tried to gather the pieces. She plastered on her brittle smile, her voice a little too high, a little too sweet. "Darling, don't be so sensitive. We're just talking. We're family." Every syllable vibrated with suppressed fury, the tremor beneath the sugar. I met her gaze evenly, calm, unwavering. My voice was flat, cool steel. Family remembers what it chooses. The sentence cut deeper than any scream could have. Vera flinched. Barely, a twitch in the corner of her mouth, a tightening of her jaw, but I caught it. Orson exhaled sharply, his facade cracking just enough for the anger beneath to show. Callista reached for her glass, her fingers trembling as they brushed the stem. The room itself seemed to shrink, the air thickening as though the walls had crept closer while no one noticed. I didn't try to fill the silence. I let it sit, heavy and unbroken, a weight pressing down on all of us. And as the quiet stretched, I saw it, their composure beginning to fray. Their masks slipping, their smiles faltering. They had expected me to rage, to cry, to collapse under their combined pressure. Instead, I sat there calm, deliberate, immovable. For years, I had been the quiet one, the shadow at the table, the afterthought. Tonight, the shadow had found shape. Tonight, silence was my blade. I reached for my phone again, thumb hovering just above the glass screen. This time, not just the slideshow of photos, but the hidden file I had prepared long ago. A video, a recording, documents, proof, receipts, the kind of evidence that did not need speeches to explain itself. The faint glow of the screen lit my face in blue. The light reflected in the polished silverware, in the crystal glasses, in the widening eyes of those who dared to look directly at me. Orson narrowed his gaze, suspicion hardening his expression. Callista whispered something under her breath, urgent and panicked, though I couldn't catch the words. Vera's hand tightened so hard around her napkin her knuckles went bone white. Inside, my body trembled, but not from fear. The tremor was focus, precision, a cold, clear determination that ran deeper than anger. I felt a kind of icy strength I had never known before, steady, unshakable. If they wanted a show, then I would give them one. Not a tantrum, not a collapse, not the outburst they expected, a reckoning, one they would never forget. When the hush fell after Orson's attack, it felt like all the air in the room condensed into silence. I let the tension settle around me, breathing slowly, holding my composure. The phone sat on the oak table beside me, its faint glow a promise. I had rehearsed this moment in my head many times, and now it was real, the moment to strip away pretense. They thought they had buried me with whispers. They forgot I carried proof. I stood, wine glass in one hand, phone in the other. The clinking of silverware softened into background hum. Now all eyes shifted. My pulse narrowed into focus. I tapped play. The TV behind Vera's head flickered to life. The first frame, me in a modest suit, accepting a public service award for a low-income housing initiative. Then scenes moved, me speaking at a community forum, me visiting families in need, colleagues telling stories of how my nonprofit had changed lives, a local news anchor calling me one of Boston's rising changemakers. The images rolled across that screen, bright and undeniable. Each clip was a rebuttal to every doubt they'd ever implied, every line they never said. They had dismissed me, ignored me, painted me invisible, but they could not erase what had already been done. My screen became a stage. When the video ended, a recorded voice, mine, echoed. I dedicate this to those who tried to silence me, because silence only makes truth louder. The room went dead still. No forced applause, no polite prattle, just shock. Orson's face blanched. Vera choked on her breath. Callista's hand froze mid-reach for her napkin. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some covered their mouths. Others sat rigid, staring. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. I placed the phone gently down. My voice was calm, measured. If I'm invisible here, it's not because I've done nothing. It's because you chose not to see. No screaming, no tears, just clarity. I watched the faces around the table, the collapsed smiles, the shifting eyes. For the first time, they weren't looking past me. They were staring at me. Calm filled me, an iced certainty. I let it sink in for them. The pulse of the moment lingered. Vera's lips parted. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Orson's gaze dropped to his hands. Callista's fingers shook slightly. A guest cleared her throat nervously. The fragile social script had snapped. I exhaled softly, letting gravity return to the room. The candles flickered. Glasses glinted. The chandelier above glowed in reflection. A new balance had settled, one where I had moved from margin to center. The war, that was over in an instant, but the cost of winning was knowing the family I lost was never mine to begin with. The night's tension still clung to the walls as dinner ended. I gathered my coat from the back of a chair, each movement deliberate, silent. No one offered to help. No one called my name. I walked past stunned faces without pause. Sometimes the loudest farewell is silence. I stepped out into the foyer, pausing only to pat my pockets for keys and phone, then moved through the front door into a brisk winter night. Snow whispered along the dark driveway. The guests behind me remained frozen, as though they'd forgotten I could leave on my own terms. Later, as I drove away, I replayed the images, whispers, and stunned faces in my mind. Inside the car, I sat in quiet. My heart ached with relief and sorrow, but also an unexpected lightness. I had confronted years of erasure. The next morning, small tremors of fallout arrived. A cousin called, voice hushed but warm. "Estelle, your toast was beautiful. I've never seen you so heard." A few guests texted, praising my courage. Behind the scenes, murmurs swirled at the party. Vera tried to spin the story, invoking family misunderstanding and misguided emotions, but I heard through the whispers that the cracks were visible. Orson, I learned, paced his chambers, furious but rattled. Callista avoided social media, no celebratory posts. The family name felt fraught now. They weren't untouchable anymore. They had been seen for what they were. I wandered the guest room where I'd slept that night. My suitcase still lay open. I picked up the framed photo Callista had placed there, of a smiling couple from Orson's board event. I turned it over and left it face down. That handshake on paper, that posed perfection. I realized how badly I wanted to believe it too once. I spent the afternoon packing quietly, pausing by the window to watch dusk drift over the yard. The branches were bare, the air cold. As I zipped up my suitcase, I let some tears come, not of defeat, but of letting go. I acknowledged something. I still longed for a family that could have loved me differently, but I also accepted that their approval was never the measure of my worth. In the quiet of that house, I remembered my anchors, my community in San Francisco, the people I served, the lives I touched, the grant letters, the photos, the thank you notes. They were evidence of a life that mattered, that I mattered. They had tried to define me by what I lacked at this table. I would define myself by what I built beyond it. When I stepped outside into the cold night air, the new year had already begun. Fireworks bloomed overhead in the distance, bursts of color against deep black. I watched them with a soft smile, breath clouding in front of me. I held my phone lightly in one hand, memories and proof resting quietly there. The year didn't end with their applause. It ended with my voice, finally mine. And that was enough. Sometimes, the ones who are supposed to protect you are the first to erase you. But when silence becomes your strength, even the loudest lies can't stand against your truth. This story reminds us, being unseen doesn't mean being unworthy. It just means your worth scares those who can't control it. Have you ever had to choose between your peace and your family? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional, powerful family stories every week.